Hi, everyone. It's Miss Man again from your Learning Center Specialist. We have finished the chapter or the book Esperanza Rising by Pam Munoz Ryan. I hope you enjoyed it. Very interesting story about coming of age, growing up. So, just like you, you're growing and you're changing. And I hope you have made some connections with Esperanza and I am going to read you the author's notes. There are some other things within in the back of the book that she has included, the author, and so I will share that with you. One of the things is hibiscus fruit punch. Um, yeah, so I'll share that with you in a different video, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Here we go. So the author's notes. I can still see my grandmother crocheting blankets in zigzag rows. She made one of these for each of her 7 children, many of her 23 grandchildren. I am the eldest of the grandchildren, and for the great grandchildren she lived to see. My grandmother, Esperanza Ortega, was the inspiration for this book. When I was a young girl, Grandma used to tell me what her life was like when she first came to the United States from Mexico. I had heard stories about the company farm camp where she lived and worked and the lifelong friends she made there. When she talked about those people and how they had helped her through her desperate, trying times, she sometimes cried at the memories. It wasn't until I had children of my own that my grandmother told me about her life in Mexico, about a fairy tale existence with servants, wealth, and grandeur, which had preceded her life in the company farm camp. I wrote down some of her recollections from her childhood. How I wish I could have written down more before she died, because I could never stop wondering about her transition from Mexico to California and what it must have been like. Eventually, I started to imagine a story based on a girl who might have been her. This fictional story parallels her life in some ways. She was born and raised in Aguas Calientes, Mexico. Her father was Cito Ortega and her mother Ramona. They lived on El Rancho de los Trinidad, Trinidad, which I changed to El Rancho de las Rosas. And her uncles did hold prominent positions in the community. A series of circumstances, including her father's death, eventually forced my grandmother to immigrate to the United States to a company owned farm labor camp in Arvin, California. Unlike Esperanza in the story, my grandmother had already married my grandfather, Jesus Munoz, when she immigrated to California. Like Miguel, he had been her father's mechanic. In the segregated Mexican camp with my grandfather, she lived much like the characters in the story. She washed her clothes in communal tubs, went to parties on Saturday nights, and cared for her first 3 daughters. That's where my mother, Esperanza Munoz, was born. During the early 1930s, there were many strikes in California's agricultural fields. Often growers evicted the strikers from their labor camps, forcing many to live together in makeshift refugee camps, sometimes on farms on the outside skirts of towns. The growers were powerful and could sometimes influence local governments. In the Kern County, sheriffs arrested picketers for obstructing traffic, even though the roads were deserted. In Kings County, one Mexican man was arrested for speaking to a crowd in Spanish. Sometimes the strikes failed, especially in areas that were flooded with people from states like Oklahoma, who were desperate for work at any wage. In other instances, the strong voices of many people changed some of the pitiful conditions. The Mexican Reparation was a very real and often overlooked part of our history. In March of 1929, the federal government passed the Deportation Act that gave counties the power to send great numbers of Mexicans back to Mexico. Government officials thought this would solve the unemployment associated with the Great Depression. It didn't. County officials in Los Angeles, California organized deportation trains, and the Immigration Bureau made sweeps in the San Fernando Valley and Los Angeles, arresting anyone who looked Mexican, regardless of whether they were citizens or in the United States legally. Many of those sent to Mexico were native born United States citizens and had never been to Mexico. The number of Mexicans deported during this so-called voluntary deportation was greater than the Native American removals of the 19th century and greater than the Japanese American relocations during World War II. It was the largest involuntary migration in the United States set up at that time. Between 1929 and 1935, at least 450,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were sent back to Mexico. Some historians think the numbers were closer to a million. Even though my grandmother lived in the country for over 50 years, I can still remember her breaking out in nervous perspiration and trembling as her passport was checked at the border when we returned to the United States from a shopping trip in Tijuana. She always carried the fear that she could be sent back on a whim, even though rep, rep, the deportation had long been over. My father, Don Bell, came to California during the Dust Bowl from the Midwest and, ironically, worked from the same company farm where my mother was born. By that time, my grandmother had moved to her family to a small home in Bakersfield at 1030 P Street. Mom and Dad weren't destined to Mom and Dad weren't destined to meet quite yet. Dad was 12 years old when he picked potatoes during World War II with the diaper crew. Children packed to pick the fields because they were great. Children paid to pick the fields because of the great shortage of workers to due due to the war. He says the children weren't always the most diligent employees, and he admits more often than that he threw dirt clods at his friends and he picked potatoes. Later, when he was 16, he spent a summer working for the same farm, driving trucks back and forth from the fields and delivering workers. Much of our nation's produce come from this one area in California. It is hot in the summer and cold in the winter. There are dust storms and tulle fog, and some people do contract valley fever. Before I got married, I took the required blood test in San Diego where I lived during my college years. The doctor called because of an urgent finding on my lab results. I worried that something dramatic had been found until the doctor said, "Yes, you have tested positive for valley fever." I let out a sigh of relief. I grew up seeing the lugs of grapes on kitchen tables. I picked plums, peaches, apricots, nectarines, persimmons, almonds, walnuts, and pecans from backyard trees. Every year in August, I saw the grapes laid down on the ground to make raisins the same way they'd been made for generations. Lemons, tomatoes, or squash appeared on our doorstep from neighbors or grandmother's gardens. I've never been conscious of having any symptoms of valley fever. The only fever I had recollected was my burning affection for my beginnings and belongings. "Of course I tested positive," I said to the doctor. "I grew up in the San Juan Valley." I knew that I had been naturally immunized to the actual disease by merely living there and from the air I had breathed growing up. My family's feelings for the company camp are deep rooted and still filled with loyalty for their start in this country and for the jobs they had at the time when so many of them had none. Most of the people I interviewed who lived in the same camp with my grandmother, held no grudges against the Oklahomans or others who competed for the jobs at that time. One man I interviewed said, "We were all so poor. The Okies, the Filipinos, they were poor too. We all knew the feelings of wanting to work and feed our families, and that is why it was so hard for many of us to strike." When I asked about prejudice, I was told, sure, there was prejudice, horrible prejudice, but that's how things were then. Many struggled just to put food on the table and sometimes seemed to be resigned to the social issues of the time. They focused only on on they focused only on survival and put their hopes and dreams into their children's and their grandchildren's futures. That's what Grandma did. She survived. All of her children learned English, and so did she. Some of her children went to college. One became a professional athlete, another a member of the United States Foreign Service, others became secretaries, a writer, an accountant, and her grandchildren, newscasters, social workers, florists, teachers, film editors, lawyers, small business owners, and another. and another writer, me. Our accomplishments were her accomplishments. We wish the best for all of us and rarely look back on the difficulties of her own life. It is no wonder that in Spanish, Esperanza means hope. Again, I will send you the rest of the um, tidbits and information that Pam Munoz Ryan has added to the back of her book. Let me know if you enjoyed it. I hope you did. I know I did. I had a hard time not crying at the end there. I don't know if you saw that or not, but